This is the third video on teachers and teaching. Now, the daily lives of students were closely governed at these training colleges, as I've alluded to already. The rules, regulations, program, and procedures of the institutions really targeted the inner character and the dispositions of students, as well as the activities outside of school hours, colors and frills on clothing, who you spoke to in public places, and so on. Now, from the 3 months of probation to the close regulation of the time and movement, the conduct and behavior of students were shaped in a way that was intended not only to normalize and control them, but also to make them humble, obedient, moral subjects. The intention of the probationary period, for example, was to allow the college staff to develop an adequate opinion of the candidate's personal habits, disposition, and style. Now, concern about the safety and propriety of the coeducational experience was characteristic of the Toronto Normal School from the beginning, and it was expressed most concretely, perhaps, in the school's physical layout, as I've alluded to already. Remember, at this time, coeducation was still considered fairly radical. Prior to this, it was considered much more proper for students to be educated separate from each other, separated by the sex. So you can see in this side here, there was a sitting room for girls or young women, and they would leave their sitting room and then go to the lecture hall by going down this hallway, this side of the hallway. Men were on the other side, and they were supposed to keep on this side of the hallway. Men were supposed to wait until the women were seated in the lecture hall, and they were only allowed to be together during these lecture periods. So that we have separate entrances as well over on the ends here. You will notice that in some of the older high schools, you will also see boys and girls entrances still, and in the old high schools that still exist today. Now, the intent was that male and female students would never be together without a master present, without one of the professors or teachers present. The fact that Thomas Graham, one student, was suspended in 1849 for tickling Jane Stevens during lectures, and John Meehan in 1850 was suspended for having used the ladies' entrance to the lecture room, clearly indicates that there was really quite severe restrictions in force very early on, even before this new building was ready. Now, suspensions and expulsions seem to have escalated in 1852 and 1853. William Irvine of Kingston, for example, was expelled for, quote, attempting to communicate with the female portion of the class and conducting himself in general unsteadily, end quote. Emily Clark was twice suspended, once for failing to report advances made to her by male students, and a second time for encouraging such advances. Another student, Griffin Lannon, got in trouble for speaking to some of the ladies in the hall, having entered it by mistake before they had left. And Lannon's refusal to apologize for remarks he made in response to their comments and laughter was termed, quote, subversive of all order and discipline, end quote, by the headmaster. Even outside of school, these restrictions remained in place. Elizabeth Douglas was suspended for speaking to a fellow student on the boat when traveling home for vacation. Mary Tobias received a warning after walking with a male student in the late evening. After doing so a second time, she left school in order to avoid expulsion. The students did protest these strict rules and regulations because, in their home life, they would have been allowed to meet with male students and talk to them. But at school, at the normal school, they weren't allowed to. And so the students had to give in when they were faced with expulsion. Now, Ryerson explained that the rules were in place for a number of reasons. Because the students were there to study and their education was being subsidized by the province, they were expected to place their full attention on their studies and avoid distractions. In addition, many students were away from home for the first time, so the rules were really intended to also reassure their parents that they were safe in a strange city. Some of the regulations were also intended to prevent students from visiting improper places in the city, and to prevent the formation of, quote, improper intimacies. These rules were not intended to interfere with normal life or normal social life. As long as they abided by the rules and participated in the social activities that were approved, they would be fine. Now, given that students were students at the normal school, if they lived from outside of Toronto, they were expected to board in houses off campus. So there was a particular concern about their conduct outside of formal school hours, because if the teachers in training got a bad reputation, it would reflect badly on the normal school and on teachers in general. Now, throughout their enrollment, they were told to, quote, conduct themselves with decorum and propriety, not merely when on the premises, but when coming to and leaving them, end quote. And so care was to be taken that in all their hours of liberty, they had as little opportunity as possible to get into mischief. In one case, a student was suspended for speaking to a fellow student while on that boat returning home for vacation. That fact reveals the tight regulation of their time and behavior away from the institutional grounds. Now, normal school students, regardless of their age or marital status, were required to board and lodge in houses approved by the Council of Public Instruction, and they were not allowed to live in hotels or public taverns. And their weekly allowance was only to be used to assist in paying for these officially approved accommodations. The greatest concern, if you haven't guessed by now, the greatest concern among faculty was the problem of intimate male-female relations in the boarding houses. These concerns led to the decision to accept only sexually segregated boarding houses for out-of-town female students. However, this really didn't solve all the problems of, quote, improper relations between male and female students. The primary focus of the master's reports on the boarding houses up until the mid-1860s was consistently about the issue of sexual morality. Thomas Graham, for example, was suspended for the second time when accused of entering the bedroom of his landlady's daughter with criminal intent. So there was some shenanigans going on. For women candidates, the rules of propriety included things about their dress and decorum as well. Their dress and decorum and propriety really were intended to reflect the idea of a humble and modest teacher. While there weren't any specific uniforms for female teachers in training, they had very clear dress codes that specified clothing was to be neat, well-kept, plain, modest, and simple. Flowers, ornaments, bright colors, jewels, ribbons, trimming, and bows were all to be avoided. Female students at the normal school were also instructed to avoid jewelry, keep their linen white, boots black, and gloves well brushed and well fitting. So you can see that they were really checking up on them at every level. These are the regulations from 1851 for the admission to the normal school in Toronto. And you can see that, it's about the age of the students. It's about the entrance exams and the certificates of moral character. They had to be able to read with ease and fluency. They had to be able to parse any common prose sentence. Do you know what parsing means? It's basically being able to break down the grammar of a sentence. They need to be able to write legibly. They need to be able to write quickly and correctly. They have to be able to give definitions of geography, have a general knowledge of the relative positions of the principal countries around the world with their capitals, oceans, seas, rivers, and so on. They have to have some basic math and arithmetic. And then here's this declaration of their intention to devote themselves to the profession of school teaching and to state that their objective in coming to the normal school is to qualify themselves better for the important duties of that profession. And then if they're admitted to the normal school, they have to promise to observe the rules and regulations of the institution, and to be diligent in the performance of their duties. So if we look at what the difference between teacher training in the 19th century and today is, in the 19th century, the normal school ran semi-annual sessions that were about 5 months in length. Today, you have to have a 4-year undergraduate degree, and then it will now take 16 months to get your Bachelor of Education in Ontario. That just changed a couple of years ago. It used to be 8 months, but that change brought it in line to the 16 to 24 months that's required in other provinces. In both now and back in the 19th century, teachers in training were grouped by the level they wanted to be able to teach. The terminology has changed. Today we call them primary, junior, and intermediate, senior. In the 19th century, it was more about the upper and lower school, first and second class, senior and junior were the terms that were used. In the 19th century, there was very much strict regimentation, a strictly regimented timetable that ensured that all the activities could be well controlled. The cycles and the rhythms of repetition were regulated. And we know that the work at the normal school was heavy. Classes began at 6:30 a.m. and the boarding school or the boarding house curfew was 9:30 p.m. On the first day of classes in 1853, one student reported that he had 49 pages of lessons to be read. In both periods, attendance was and is required. So in the 19th century normal school, students received a weekly allowance if they followed the rules and remained in attendance during the entire session. The allowance was intended to help them pay for their boarding houses. Today, they don't have this allowance, but your attendance is still required because it is a professional program. You still have to meet a certain amount. You can't miss classes. You have to be in class a certain amount of time, as well as have a certain number of days for your practicum or your placement. Any absences you had to provide a written explanation, whether it's a doctor's note or some other note that was sent in the 19th century to the headmaster, and today it goes through the whole university process. In the 19th century, this kind of rigid attendance schedule was quite difficult because different schools would have different periods of time for their school sessions. So some schools might start later in the fall term and go later in June. And if it was hard for the teacher to get away from the school, then they might not be able to attend the normal school if they wanted to. At the Toronto Normal School, the students did the practice teaching in the attached model school. Today, of course, student teachers go out on 3 placements for a total of about 80 days. And I'm going to pause here and we'll continue this in the next video.